All right. Well, I want to start by just thanking you for being here. I know you're really busy, and I know we have a pretty big time change between the two of us. And so I just really want to thank you for joining me in the time zone you're in. And I'm really excited to talk to you. And I hope that people today get to learn quite a bit more about silent payments, about you, what you work on, how these tools come to be for all of us people who use them, and other tools that you're working on and things for the future. Um, do you want to start by just introducing yourself for people who may not know who you are?
Yeah, sure. And again, yeah, thanks to you guys as well for having me and for working with the time zone differences. Intro for myself, I'm Josie Bake. I work on Bitcoin Core full time as a contributor. I've been doing that for about three-ish years now. Initially started off working on the wallet and kind of looking at things from a UX and privacy standpoint. And then over the years, I've been involved in a lot of other stuff. A lot of stuff around like developer education, getting more people involved, contributing to Bitcoin projects, and then some more infrastructure type stuff more recently, like the lib Bitcoin kernel project and a few other things. Um, but yeah, a lot of my focus tends to be around privacy stuff and privacy and user experience in particular, because I started off using Bitcoin as a user. And so then as a developer, kind of the thing I get most passionate about is making the software more usable for people. And in particular, when it comes to privacy, making the most private way to use Bitcoin the easiest way.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm wondering this too. How does the interface or how does the way that somebody uses their device influence the kind of privacy they can receive? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so I mean, the classic example right here with silent payments in this topic is address reuse. I think when you're using Bitcoin the first time, it's a bit of a different payment experience than you'd expect, where you have to interact with the person and ask them for an address or a set of addresses like an XPub. And then every single time you want to pay them again, you have to ask for a fresh one to be using like the most private recommended way. But that kind of introduces friction right away. So we've seen users just default to reusing addresses, or if you go to an exchange, they'll give you a single address that you deposit to multiple times. So I think that's one example where the most natural way people would expect to use Bitcoin, right away, you end up using it kind of in a non-private way. And then to use it more privately, you have to go through these extra steps that create friction around every interaction. So I think that's, like a really clear example for this talk, but there's quite a few others where it in Bitcoin in particular, you have to be aware of a lot of different tools and how to use those tools to get better privacy, which I think leads to only power users really being able to use them, or people not really understanding the implications of how they might be hurting their privacy when they use a pretty complex system like Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's really well said. And this is actually a problem I've seen because I have a privacy background myself, and a lot of privacy tools, the successful ones, do a good job of making privacy easy and frictionless. And so it's really cool that you kind of bring that philosophy into what you do. Have you had, because you said you worked on some infrastructure stuff as well, are you able to integrate some of your privacy beliefs into the infrastructure side of things, or do you see that more so on the end user side of things?
That's a good question. I think it's a combination of both. On the infrastructure side of things, I think we can build better software, better wallets, to have more privacy by default and kind of have more like a more frictionless experience for the user. And in particular with Bitcoin, I think there's lots of opportunities to do this today without resorting to soft forks. And then if we talk about, other types of privacy improvements, some might require soft forks, and that's all going to be at like the software and the protocol level. And then from the user side, I think it boils a lot down to education, like making sure people are aware of how things work and what the implications are when they use Bitcoin in one way or another. Um, so ideally, when we tackle a problem like privacy, I think we have to think about both. What are the software changes that we can make, and then also what's the user education that we need to do?
Yeah, really interesting stuff. I want to ask you eventually about user education versus just making privacy a default questionably, and just how you feel about that. But before we get to that, I want to talk about your recent developments, which is especially with BIP 352, silent payments. Um, how did you end up being one of the authors for this? I'm also still learning kind of the way that Bitcoin works, in terms of the community and how developers are picked to do certain things. So if you can kind of explain how you ended up with that gig, it would help me a lot. And also, I'm sure other people know how you got involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think me as well is still trying to figure out how all of this works in Bitcoin. There isn't really a set way. So how I got involved with silent payments, I had been thinking about usability and privacy stuff in the wallet based on some work I'd been doing related to coin selection, like how we could be more private in the transaction based on coin selection and the output scripts that we chose. And then I was also thinking about address reuse, because when you do analytics on the blockchain, you can quickly see address reuse is one of these things that damages privacy for pretty much everybody, because we have these like large clusters from exchanges where people are reusing addresses. So I was thinking a lot about these problems, and then I heard a talk at TabConf in October of 2022, I think, which is a Bitcoin technical conference. And I heard a talk from Ruben Thompson, who is the author, the co-author on BIP 352, and he was giving a talk on silent payments where it was more just a proposal that he had written, I think the year before. And there was no BIP or kind of plan yet. He was just kind of putting out this idea of building on the history of stealth addresses in Bitcoin, going back to like the original proposal and then BIP 47, and then silent payments is kind of this new, fresh take on it. So I heard the talk and I was really, really impressed with it. And it kind of scratched the itch for me of something that seemed like it would bring better privacy, but along with better UX. And so I went up and spoke to him after the talk and was like, how can I help move this along? Because I think this is a great idea. So we both agreed the next step would be write a BIP, and then he and I just met over the next year. I mean, pretty much on a weekly basis, and just started writing down the BIP. For context, BIPs in Bitcoin land are just Bitcoin improvement proposals, and they're really just technical documentation. They can be for anything from the protocol definitions and soft forks down to like application layer stuff, which is where silent payments falls. So we started writing the BIP together, started doing a lot of testing, writing test cases, working on implementations. That process took, I mean, pretty much all of 2023. Sent it to the mailing list for review, initial rounds of review with other folks and wallet developers, and then that kind of culminated in the BIP being merged, or more like finalized, right around the time that Cake would have started on the implementation. And then ever since then, after the BIP is out there, I've been working on implementation stuff. So working on an implementation for Bitcoin Core, working on the libsecp module, which is the cryptography library for Bitcoin, and then also working on chatting with folks in like BDK and Rust Bitcoin to see how we can get this merged into the libraries and SDKs that people use in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's something I'm especially excited for because I'm sure people who have used silent payments might have learned by now that both people need to use a wallet that use silent payments. As far as I know, correct me on anything I say that might be incorrect, Josie, but someone has to be able to send silent payments and someone has to receive it. And so once those SDKs go live, a lot more wallets and a lot more people should have access to this technology, which is really exciting. Is that correct in my understanding?
Yeah, so with any new protocol, especially ones that introduce a new address format, I think there's two things that need to happen. People first need to understand this new address format and be able to send to it. And so in silent payments, that's the sending side. And then another example of this would be, when Taproot first rolled out in Bitcoin, there was a soft fork that activated Taproot. Taproot introduced a new address format, but then exchanges and other people were kind of slow to update. So, if you wanted to withdraw from an exchange to your wallet and your wallet supported Taproot, it wouldn't work because the exchanges didn't know how to send to Taproot addresses. So in silent payments, it's kind of the same process where we've introduced this new address format, which means the first and most important thing is that wallets be able to send to a silent payment address. And the protocol, we designed it such that wallets only have to implement the half that they're interested in. So we could have a bunch of wallets that just implement sending support, which is designed to be the simpler and easier to implement. And that way they don't need to do anything with scanning or anything like that. And then the wallets that want to receive silent payments are the ones that need to do the more complicated implementation for receiving. But for most of these things, I think in like an adoption rollout, you want broad sending support at first, because that kind of signals to exchanges, wallets, other services that if there's broad sending support, there's good motivation then to work on the receiving support. If you do the receiving support first, you do all that hard work to do receiving, and then nobody can send to your address, which kind of leaves you in a bad place. So I think you're mostly right that we do need both sides of this adoption. But I think one of the nice things about silent payments is you can do it in this kind of two-phase way, where we first focus on sending support and then on receiving. And
Yeah.
yeah, to kind of touch back on that point of like libraries, I think that's really important just in general in open source, because a lot of these wallets and things that software people have built, it's, volunteer teams or underfunded projects with only a few developers. And so when you go around to a bunch of different wallets and ask them to do extra work, I think that conversation goes a lot better when you're like, hey, by the way, we noticed you use this library like BDK, for example. We've upstreamed most of the complexity and logic into this library to make your life easier on implementation. So that's kind of why I think this approach is pretty important of focusing first on the upstream infrastructure and libraries for wallets.
Yeah, and I guess because we're just so early on, um, I want to see silent payments in every wallet. But is that going to happen? I know there's some technologies that have been rolled out in Bitcoin that end up in some wallets, but it never gets that massive mainstream adoption that we want to see. Do you think that silent payments will be like a mainstream tool found in most Bitcoin wallets in the future?
I certainly hope so. I mean, at the very least, I would hope that the majority of wallets that people use today implement sending support, and then that we see also multiple options for people on the receiving side. Um, I'm also kind of, it's one of those things where obviously I think it's a good idea. There's some other folks that are excited about it, but you kind of just got to wait and see what the reaction is from everybody else. I'm fairly confident that once people start using silent payments in a wallet and they get used to that new user experience, it kind of clicks. So I'm not too worried about the adoption. Um, but the other thing too is like it's like you got to let the free market decide on this one. You can't. It's not a company where we can go around and tell these projects, hey, by the third quarter, you guys all have to implement silent payments. You really just put the proposal out there. You create as much tooling and education as you can, and then it's kind of up to what the different wallets want to do and what their customers are asking for.
One really cool thing about adoption for silent payments, which I think is really underrated, is the way I see it, it has a lot of influencer potential. And what I mean by that is um, a lot of people who are in public spaces, they have a lot of followers or they're politicians. Um, if they start utilizing these addresses and people want to send them money, they're going to have to start understanding what silent payments are. And I think that that kind of influence that these people have, assuming they actually implement silent payments, would be really massive and can make a pretty big dent in terms of adoption, which is a very unique thing about silent payments. I think it really targets people who want to be able to receive money and keep their followers private in some ways. Um, I,
I think that's a great call out. I think there is a pretty big opportunity here because before silent payments, I don't think we actually had a good tool or technology to recommend for this use case of I would like to post a public address somewhere and I would like to receive donations or tips or whatever from people. Um, and going back to the history of Bitcoin and different BIPs, there were ways you could get kind of close to this, but they were always kind of missing something. And so I think silent payments enables that use case that is kind of natural, like you said, for some of these more public facing things. I think the other reason it could potentially pick up and take off pretty quickly is it brings more of a Bitcoin username experience, which if you're coming from a traditional payments app like Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, you're very used to this idea, or even, like routing numbers for banks. You're very used to this idea of getting a static piece of information, which is either, a routing number or a username or an email address. And then you can use that over and over and over again anytime you want to send or interact with that person. And so then silent payments is a primitive that allows that. And I think once people get used to using Bitcoin that way, it's just a much cleaner and more simpler flow. So then people will start to advocate, hey, use a wallet that we can use usernames with because it's just a better experience.
Yeah, so are you kind of referring to using BIP39 alongside silent payments? Is that
No, more saying that silent payments is a static address that can be
got it?
reused.
Got it.
And then there was another great BIP that came out around the same time, BIP 353. And what BIP 353 does is it gives a protocol for putting your payment instructions under a DNS text record. And so it was kind of designed with like Bolt 12, which is a similar idea for Lightning. We have this static invoice instead of one-time invoices. And it works really well with silent payments as well, where you can have this username thing that you set up, and then people can pay to that, not even knowing that under the hood it's using silent payments. But the reason this wasn't possible before, you had BIP 353, but we didn't have an on-chain way that was safe to use with something like this, where it was safe to reuse and it was a static piece of information. So it kind of all came together, I think, this year in a way that makes it a little bit more obvious what the UX improvement is going to be.
Cool, thank you. I put into my search engine here while you were talking Bitcoin usernames BIP, and it kept coming up with 39, which makes sense. And then Seth's blog comes up down the road, which references
Yes,
properly 353.
Seth's blog is great. It goes through a very simple step-by-step from, maybe you've never even purchased a domain before. So he's got instructions on how to get a domain through like Namecheap, or there's another one in there that's more of a privacy preserving one. So getting the domain and then setting it up with a Bolt 12 offer and a silent payment address. It takes, maybe 15 minutes to run through the whole thing. And I would encourage people to take a look at it, because once you go through that blog, then I think it kind of clicks like, oh, this is why this is a better user experience.
Yeah, and it ties into everything you were saying earlier. It's kind of cool to hear about your story about getting into Bitcoin and kind of having this privacy become more usable. And not only silent payments, but it being combined with something like usernames just, I think, really seals the deal. And it sounds like you found the perfect little development window to strike. Um, Speaking about the privacy implications of silent payments, what does silent payments protect for the sender and the receiver, and what doesn't it protect for the sender and receiver?
Yeah, great question. I think the first thing to do is maybe set the terms a little bit better, because when we say privacy on Bitcoin, I think a lot of people hear be all end all solution. So, BIP 352 solves all the privacy problems in Bitcoin, or it doesn't. And I tend to think of privacy more as like privacy at different layers of how you're using Bitcoin. So one thing that silent payments, we'll start with what silent payments does address. Before silent payments, the only way to communicate how you want to receive and send Bitcoin is by passing around the actual on-chain addresses that you're going to use. And these are the ones that we're familiar with, BC1Q, BC1P addresses. You could also give people an XPub, which allows them to generate multiple addresses for you. But at the end of the day, if anyone has access to that address or that XPub, then they can just go to a block explorer. They can look up that address, and then they can see all the transactions on chain related to it. So this is kind of like privacy, I would call like the wallet application layer. And it means that in order to send a transaction to someone in Bitcoin where only the sender and the receiver know about it, you have to have a secure communication channel to give them that address. You can't post it publicly anywhere. You can't even, like, let's say I was texting my addresses to someone and it's just SMS. Whoever's reading those text messages can also just log those addresses and then monitor them to see what's going on chain. If we think about, BIP353, if we put just a regular Bitcoin address in there, someone could just ping that username, copy the address, and then wait to see if anyone uses it. So this is what silent payments addresses. It now gives an address format where the only two people who would be aware of the resulting on-chain address is the sender and the receiver. And it doesn't matter who sees the actual silent payment address. And you can take a silent payment address, you can try to look it up in a block explorer, you won't see anything. There's also nothing that an outside observer can do if they have a silent payment address to link it to its on-chain transaction. So now we've kind of made it so that we have this address that is safe to reuse, and it's also safe to post publicly with a guarantee that only the sender and the receiver are going to be able to identify the on-chain scripts and on-chain addresses that are generated from it. Now, what this doesn't solve is it doesn't change anything about on-chain privacy for Bitcoin. So like kind of the classic one is, if I send you a transaction, if I send you some Bitcoin, you can see all the inputs to that transaction, UTXOs. And if I have a change output that goes back to me, you can see, okay, well, in this transaction, there are two outputs. One of them is going to me. The other one is a change one going back to Josie. So I know that Josie has at least this much in his wallet based on that change. And over time, you can kind of learn more about someone's balance based on what their wallet is doing. So silent payments doesn't do anything about the actual transaction that goes into the blockchain. All of the same heuristics still apply. All of the same tools that people have been recommended to use to break that link should still be used. So one example is coin joins work as a way to kind of obfuscate and hide which UTXOs are coming from the sender and where the recipient is. So if you're using silent payments without some of these other tools, it's going to be the same level of privacy on-chain as before, if that makes sense.
Got it. And is this permanently going to be what silent payments offers users, or are there going to be updates into how silent payments works so that it can offer additional protections down the road?
Yeah, another great question. So the way I look at things like silent payments and some of these other private, well, I guess just how I try to think about privacy in general is, rather than find a be-all end-all solution that fixes everything, work on creating focused solutions that compose well with each other. So I think silent payments is a good example of, it's a focused solution that solves these privacy problems at the application layer, but we designed it in such a way to be forward-looking with, will silent payments work with stuff like coin joins? Will it work with stuff like pay joins? And put a lot of thought in the bit to make sure that we didn't back ourselves into a corner there. So I think maybe the next obvious step for something like silent payments would be writing a coin join protocol that works with silent payments. And the nice thing is that wouldn't require any changes to the silent payments bit today, but it would require us to do the research and create a coin join protocol that understands silent payments. So that's one thing that I think is good future work for privacy. The other area that I'm super interested in and have been spending a lot of time thinking about is how we can improve privacy in the interaction between on-chain and Lightning. Because I think Lightning has its own set of privacy trade-offs and problems that are being worked on. But I think there's this really interesting design space where we can get better privacy for the payment activity of the user by having more of a seamless experience from how do you get your on-chain UTXOs into Lightning channels. And so some topics here that I think are interesting are wallets that do a unified balance, where your on-chain UTXOs are being turned into Lightning channels or swapped into an existing channel, and then your payments are happening over Lightning where there is no on-chain record. And that's an area that I would like to see in the future. We have something that works well, where Sonnet Payments kind of just seamlessly integrates with being able to swap them into Lightning channels. That would probably require an update to the BIP, so a new Sonnet Payments version, but we'll see.
Nice, really cool that you left it available to be improved in the future. It seems like the more I'm hearing about the development behind the scenes, it's a lot of thought that goes into this stuff. I mean, you mentioned obviously what you just mentioned, but also earlier you talked about how you developed it so that people could either implement just sending or receiving to help adoption, and it's those little details that I think are really really neat to learn about. Um,
I think that's,
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I would want to comment on that real quick because I think it's an astute observation. So if you look at the original draft, or this, the original idea of silent payments from Ruben, the core of the protocol didn't change much in us, writing the BIP. Like the basic cryptography of the scheme is largely unchanged from what he had written back in, like, I think 2021. So really that 6 to 8 months of writing the BIP was thinking about all of these things, like, can we create a forward compatible address scheme? Are we sure that silent payments will work with something like CoinJoin? Are we sure it'll work with something like Frost or Music2, which are some other changes in Bitcoin that are happening? And that ended up being the more difficult part, right? Like the idea of silent payments is, I would say, somewhat simple when you just look at the cryptography involved, but then how to integrate that into the broader Bitcoin ecosystem and how to make sure that it's compatible with other privacy tools and other protocols, that was surprisingly difficult and ended up taking, I think, the majority of our time.
Wow, that's not something I would have guessed, and it's a really neat detail. Um, I guess regarding the implementation, because a lot of the technologies that you're talking about with silent payments sound familiar to other technologies found in other projects. So I wanted to ask, does silent payments take any influence from other projects in this space?
Yeah, I would say there was if we take silent payments as kind of this broader topic of stealth addresses, and in this, I would say, silent payments isn't really a new, or it's not really a brand new idea, but it's an iteration on some old ideas. So you had, and this is where I'm not super clear on all the timelines, so I'll probably say something incorrect here, but generally, I think 2012, 2013, there was a proposal for stealth addresses on Bitcoin. Then very quickly, Monero came around, and then they had the stealth addresses, which was similar to the Bitcoin stealth addresses. And then I think other chains have kind of come up with stealth address type approaches. Then later you had BIP47 in Bitcoin, which was an iteration on stealth addresses that used BIP32, hierarchically deterministic wallets, and it used op returns and some other stuff. And then silent payments is kind of what I would say the third iteration on that in Bitcoin. So with a lot of this stuff, like, there's nothing new under the sun. And sometimes we're just, reinventing things for the nth time. But what I think is interesting about silent payments is there were good ideas in all of those proposals that came before, but they made certain trade-offs based on where Bitcoin was at the time. And so silent payments, to me, it was kind of the right idea at the right time. Because one thing, to kind of put an example to it, some of these older schemes for stealth addresses in Bitcoin were trying to avoid doing a lot of computation and using block space as a way to get around that. So they would encrypt shared secrets in an op return, like in the stealth address scheme, or they would create a payment channel with a notification transaction, like in BIP47. And all of this was using block space to get around needing to do computation. But then, since then, there's been lots of innovations in Bitcoin on the computation side. So libsecp, the library came out, which optimized a lot of the cryptographic computation that we do. Schnorr signatures adds some nice optimizations, which didn't exist before Taproot. And then block space has gotten more and more expensive. So some of these older schemes that relying on using block space are now going to, I would say, get priced out as we go along. And silent payments can rely on getting rid of the storage and instead offloading that to computation because the computation has gotten much better. So to kind of tie back into your question, I think there's a lot of inspiration and drawing from different ideas and kind of retrying old ideas, but with more tooling and things that we've learned over the years.
I'm kind of, because I've been kind of typing out questions as you're talking, and I'm seeing two general groups here. I have more development questions for you, and then after that, I have more future-oriented stuff. So that's how I'm grouping it up back here. So I'm going to go ahead and actually ask a few more development questions and go back a little bit because I think it's really fascinating. Um, I this is kind of a loose question, but what was a big challenge? I guess you've already talked about multiple challenges, but was there a big challenge when developing BIP 352?
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge, um, or at least the one that I spent probably the most time thinking about, was how can we not how can we make the protocol generally useful? So one way to think about this would be like robust and not over specified, while also making sure that it works with things like coin joins. So making silent payments work with coin joins was pretty important to me, and that ended up being very tricky to figure out. How can we have a version of silent payments that isn't brittle, like has all these like ifs, ands, and things you have to check, but then also works with a protocol like CoinJoin. It's an area that still, when I look back and read the BIP, I know, I think I've convinced myself we can't do any better, but it's still the part that kind of like, man, I wish we had something cleaner for that. I think that was one area where at least I spent a lot of time, and we had a lot of back and forth discussion about different solutions and how to do it. And finally, we just had to make a choice that we were like, okay, we think this is the best we're going to be able to do, which is tricky. I think the other part that was challenging in BIP 352 specifically was trying to imagine how wallets were going to use this and then recognizing that silent payments as a scheme doesn't really work with a lot of the infrastructure that wallets have previously used, like the Electrum, like address lookup servers. Um, and this is where I think like some of the engineers at Cake could speak to that because they ended up forking an Electrum server to do it. And so it was tricky when designing the protocol to try to look into the future and imagine how developers were going to use it and try to make sure that we were doing things that would make it easy enough to use without compromising how we built the protocol. So I ended up doing a lot of research on the light client side, trying to figure out how much of a burden would it be for light clients to scan and collect some data around that. And I think that was tricky because on the one hand, you do just kind of want to write your protocol in the most like theoretically perfect sense, but then pragmatically we want to see it get adopted. So we had to kind of think about, all right, what are some changes we can make to the protocol that makes it easier to integrate with the Bitcoin ecosystem as it exists today. And I think that's challenging because it's not just a tech question, right? Where you just can't like lock yourself in a room and think about the math and the cryptography and the technical side of it. And you have to also think, okay, if we have two different choices of how to design this protocol, what are the implications for adoption with one or the other? And I think one of the things that makes it hard is there's no really good answer there. You kind of just have to pick one and go with it and see how it ends up.
Right, and I actually see Raphael in listening in, who's the developer on our ends who implemented it. So I know that they put a lot of hard work into that. Um, and you're talking a lot about compromises, and one compromise I'm really curious about. Was there a privacy compromise? Could you have made silent payments more private in some ways, but at the cost of something else like usability?
Yeah, I think this is one area where we did. I think we did a good job where when Ruben and I were designing it, we kind of started from the idea that the thing that we didn't want to compromise was privacy. So one example of this, there was some early discussions about, hey, what if we could cut down on the scanning requirement if we, change something about the transaction, like we added something to the unlock time field or we ground another field, and all of these things would have left a small but detectable fingerprint on the transaction where someone outside could look at the transaction and they wouldn't be able to tell which silent payment address it came from, but they could probably tell it's a silent payment transaction. And so that's an area where when we were kind of faced with those compromises, we went more to the privacy side, and I'm pretty happy with the end results of that. I think another area where in the early days of discussing the protocol, where it came down to a protocol choice with privacy implications was to define in the protocol that the taproots, that the outputs need to be taproot outputs. And there was some feedback we got from different groups saying, well, no, that should be configurable by the receiver. The receiver should be able to say in their silent payment address, these are the type of outputs that I want you to create for me. And we ended up going with saying, no, it's got to be taproot. Now, making it taproot also gave us some nice optimizations we could do on the scanning side. But the real reason there was the theory is, as more and more taproot adoption goes on, that everything on chain will start to be indistinguishable from each other. So lightning channels that are lightning opens and closes that are taproot would be indistinguishable from a silent payment transaction. People doing multi-sigs with things like music to and frost would be indistinguishable from any other taproot use case. So picking taproot as kind of defined by the protocol, I think, was an area where we decided to make a decision on the privacy side. So not to pat ourselves on the back too hard, but I think we were able to work through some of those decisions and always end up with something that we felt like privacy was still the number one use case of the protocol.
Really cool. It's cool that you didn't compromise on that. Um, is there just a fun story before I move on to kind of the future of silent payments and privacy in Bitcoin? Do you just have a fun story? I feel like there's always at least one crazy thing that happens developing any new technology. Um, and if the answer is nothing, that's fine too.
I don't know if it's a fun story, but I think me needing to constantly temper my expectations, got super excited when I heard about it, and then I was like, Ruben, all right, we'll be able to write this BIP in a couple months, and then, 8 months later, we're still like refining the BIP. And then I started working on the Bitcoin Core implementations, and I wrote a ton of code and got them working. And I was like, oh, okay, these are ready to go. We're gonna merge in Bitcoin Core. And then, as we started to get some review and feedback, people were like, really, this low-level cryptography stuff shouldn't be in the Bitcoin Core code base. It should be in libsecp. So let's pull it out and write a libsecp module. And then I was like, okay, cool. The libsecp module won't take long. And then, 3 months later, I'm still writing the libsecp module, and now we've got that finished and we're waiting on review. So I think maybe funny for the other people that were working with me who had to kind of keep dealing with my unbridled optimism, and then me having to like keep walking back from it and recognizing it's going to take longer. In the moment, that didn't feel very fun, but I think it is fun to look back on a project and think, what did I think going into this, how long it was going to take, how difficult it was going to be, and then what actually happened and what can I learn from that when thinking about the next project that I'm going to do and how to scope the work and kind of estimate how long things are going to take. So maybe just more of an anecdote.
Nice. Yeah, and that's actually kind of a perfect segue into the future because it seems like it's still not merged into Bitcoin Core, correct?
Yep.
So what's that waiting on as somebody who's not super familiar with the process of that merge process?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing I would mention is it's not necessary for silent payments to be implemented in Bitcoin Core versus maybe some other protocols. And so for an example of another very large protocol that got finished and merged recently in Bitcoin Core, which is BIP 324. And BIP 324 encrypts all of the Bitcoin peer-to-peer traffic. And so that didn't, like silent payments, didn't require a soft fork, but does need to be in Bitcoin Core because Bitcoin Core is the one doing all of the peer-to-peer stuff. Silent payments is instead just about wallets and how wallets communicate to each other to have addresses to send and receive. And Bitcoin Core, the project, has a wallet, right? So getting it into Bitcoin Core is really just getting it into the Bitcoin Core wallet, but that doesn't stop any other wallet from starting to implement it, which is why we saw Cake Wallet implementing, and then a few other wallets have started to implement. I think getting it into Bitcoin Core is nice because Bitcoin Core I tend to think of as like the reference for a lot of this other stuff, to see how it all fits together. And Bitcoin Core is the wallet that I use, and so I obviously want to use silent payments without needing to change my wallet or my workflow. But the process for getting merged into Bitcoin Core can be quite slow because while I'm excited about silent payments and I see usefulness in it, there's tons of other stuff going on in Bitcoin Core that are also equally or arguably more important. So you're kind of competing. Your project is competing with everyone else's for review time, and then you need to find reviewers who are also interested about and care about that feature. I think the other thing that has made silent payments maybe be a little bit slower to get merged into Bitcoin Core is needing to upstream the cryptography to libsecp. And when we're putting a module in libsecp, the 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 bar for review is very high. We don't want to put stuff in libsecp that is unsafe to use or not well documented. So that's naturally just kind of a slower review process, and there's just less people working in that project. So I think right now we're waiting on the libsecp module to get reviewed and merged, and then once that's in libsecp, then we can rebase all of the Bitcoin Core PRs on that. And then after that, it's just a matter of who has time to review it and how quickly we can go through that cycle. But I'm excited to see that other wallets have kind of started to pick up developing this without waiting on Bitcoin Core.
Yeah, and it seems like from what you're saying, Bitcoin Core, it being implemented, might help adoption for other wallets because they can reference it, but for the most part, that's not preventing people from
Yeah,
still
yeah,
using it.
exactly. It's something. There's really no hard dependence on Bitcoin Core. I think another benefit of having it in something like Bitcoin Core is still, if you want kind of the most privacy on Bitcoin today, you should be running your own full node. And if we have something where a user can just, run a Bitcoin node, have a wallet that has the features they want, I think it becomes simpler for people, um, without them needing to like run Bitcoin Core, then run an Electrum server on top of it, then connect their wallet to the Electrum server. Like this is totally possible, and I think this is a way that we'll see wallets doing stuff like silent payments. But I want to have that be an option where it's like if you don't know quite what you're doing, but you're able to and willing to run a Bitcoin node, then just run the Bitcoin node, and now you get features like silent payments and everything right there ready to go, which I think is pretty nice.
Really nice. Okay, I have a few more questions that are kind of just random questions that I couldn't find a place to ask earlier, but I still think they're really interesting and I'd love to hear your takes on them. So, the first one is, does wallet implementation of silent payments matter in terms of privacy? Can a wallet implement silent payments more privately than another one? And if so, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is only really relevant. Well, it's mostly relevant on the receiving side. So how wallets decide to do a silent payments receiving implementation, I think, does have implications for the privacy guarantees. So an example of that, if you're running your own Bitcoin node, you're downloading blocks yourself, you're verifying transactions all yourself, you're doing everything yourself. That's kind of the most private way you could enable something like silent payments. If you're using what I'll call a light client, and my definition of a light client is any wallet application where the user is not running their own node. So for an example of something that does not qualify as a light client to me, if I'm using a wallet like Cake Wallet and I'm connecting it to my own Electrum server, which means I'm running my own Bitcoin node somewhere, I'm not really using a light client. I'm using more of like a remote control app or something, whatever term we want to use. So for light client implementations, there where the light client is not, it's connecting to some third party node to get information. There's decisions you can make on the privacy standpoint there, where if the light client is using something like BIP 158, which is compact block filters, that's going to be the most private way that they can scan for regular transactions, but also silent payment transactions. Another version of this, which I think is the version that Cake is using, is privacy preserving scanning, where the server sends the tweaks along with the outputs to check, and then the Electrum server learns nothing about which outputs belong to the user. That's another privacy preserving way. Uh, a non-private way you could implement silent payments is you could hand out your scan key, and just in case people aren't aware, that the silent payment address has two keys, one for scanning, one for spending. And so a non-private implementation would be, I can give my scan key to a third-party service, and that third-party service can do the scanning for me and just alert me of when I find transactions. And for light clients, this matters because then the light client doesn't need to download any data, so it's better for bandwidth. And this is kind of similar to how some of the wallets exist today, where you're kind of outsourcing information to the server. So like in an Electrum address lookup server, you're giving them addresses and saying, hey, tell me when something happens on these addresses. So you're giving up your privacy to the whoever's running the server. And you could do the same thing in silent payments. I do think it's worth mentioning that, for a lot of these things, we also have to be more clear about like privacy against who. No matter how you implement silent payments in your wallet, you do have the guarantee that no outside observer is going to be able to look at your silent payment address and then connect it to on-chain transactions, unless they're actually the person who did the transaction. So when we talk about, privacy preserving on the light client side, we're really talking about privacy against whoever you're using as your wallet provider. So if there's, if you're paying for a service or you're using something a service that you trust, you can outsource the key to them, and then you just have to have the understanding that whoever has that scan key can also see your transactions, just like if you were using an Electrum server or an XPub. So one of the things that I'm happy about with silent payments is I feel like there's more options now on how to do it, where people can kind of make these trade-offs of, I don't want to run a full node, but I am willing to have an app that requires a little bit more bandwidth to preserve my privacy against any service provider. Or if I don't want to spend that bandwidth, I can outsource the scanning to a third party, knowing that now that third party, I'm sharing information with that third party. And to kind of tie it back into what we talked about earlier, I think this is more the education point, where we just got to educate the users about the trade-offs that they're making. I feel like there's some misconceptions with how a lot of wallets work today, where people think that, if they're using public Electrum servers, they actually have decent privacy, which isn't true. So I think just kind of explaining to people, like, this is the spectrum of things that you can do, and this is what you get at each one. And on the very far end of it, you run your own node, you do everything yourself, you've got the best privacy. In the middle, you have privacy, but at the cost of needing to download some bandwidth on a mobile app, which maybe isn't great. And then you can go to the other end and have like the best user experience on the app, but then you're outsourcing that privacy to a third party.
Yeah, a quick question on that. Is there still privacy benefit, just playing devil's advocate, for somebody trying to use one of these services that might outsource the bandwidth downloading for them and you give them a key? Is there still a privacy benefit in that situation if they use silent
Yeah,
payments?
I think so. I think you're like, again, you now have something that didn't exist before, which is the ability to post your silent payment address publicly, to give it to people and know that no, third party can link that address to the on-chain transactions. This is something that we couldn't do before, and now we can do regardless of how your wallet client is doing the scanning. And then, for these people that maybe are outsourcing the scanning to a third party, they've limited, now they know, okay, well, whoever I gave the scan key to, now I know that they know my transactions, but I know that only they know my transactions, unless of course they're sharing that key with other people. But I would say the benefit, and this is where I'm really excited to see broad sending support and then talking to exchanges. I think the ecosystem benefit for privacy is if we can make silent payments more a norm for how people interact with exchanges. So imagine every exchange, when you sign up for the exchange, they give you a static deposit address that is specific to you. And you use that deposit address anytime you want to deposit to the exchange. And then maybe, you have a silent payment address for withdrawals as well. So every time you withdraw from the exchange, they would show up to the silent payment address. And what this would do, if this was widely adopted, is pretty much get rid of the biggest address reusers on chain we have today, which is people interacting with exchanges. And the reason people reuse these addresses with exchanges is it's just a better user experience rather than the person needing to get a fresh address from the exchange every time that they want to deposit to the exchange, which is, if you're someone who doesn't really understand Bitcoin that well, that can be quite scary to have to like re-verify that address every single time, every time you get a new address. And it also opens up, all these problems where people will trick you into sending to an address that isn't really the exchange. So I think one of the most important things for the true impact of the privacy benefits of silent payments would be to make this more the norm of people sending to exchanges that support silent payments, because then we just get rid of these giant address clusters on chain, which then make it kind of easy to see how large flows of Bitcoin are moving and to tag and like, okay, well, we know that these addresses are to these exchanges and et cetera. So that's where I would say even if the user is willing to compromise a little bit on their individual privacy against a third party, there's still a benefit to the entire ecosystem if we can get rid of address reuse at large.
That'd be a super cool future, and I really hope to see that happen because that would really just elevate the whole experience. Um, a bit of a, it doesn't have to be a touchy subject, and I feel like it's something people should talk about more, and I'd love to get kind of your take on it because you're somebody who values privacy, and I already know some people would ask, well, why bother trying to make Bitcoin more private? How do you feel about improving Bitcoin's privacy versus using dedicated privacy coins, um, like as an individual?
Yeah, for me, I can only answer for myself on that one. Bitcoin is the one that I understand the most. It's the one that I've spent the most time, learning about, building up expertise in. So that's my personal answer. Like, why do I personally spend time working on Bitcoin? It's like, well, it's the one I understand and feel the most excited to work on. And I do feel that we have a lot of runway in terms of what we can do to improve Bitcoin's privacy. I feel like we have a lot of runway today, right now, without requiring soft forks, just making improvements to, through things like silent payments, and encouraging more taproot adoption. I think there's also a lot of room for privacy improvements on Bitcoin, like I mentioned earlier, when we talk about wallets that are now giving a user more of a unified experience, where they have this seamless balance that works across Lightning and on chain. And I think there's just a huge design space there for privacy improvements. And then we can get into soft forks, and there's soft forks being proposed for Bitcoin that could have major improvements to privacy. So I don't feel like we've run out of things to work on Bitcoin. Now let's say maybe we did, and we've all guaranteed, we all proved to ourselves we've made Bitcoin as private as possible. If it wasn't, if we'd reached that barrier and it was as private as it was ever going to be, then maybe potentially I'd look at other privacy projects. But at least for right now, I just feel there's plenty of runway here. So that's where I like to spend my time. I also think when we start talking about other dedicated privacy projects, I just feel like there's no such thing as a free lunch. And whatever dedicated privacy system you're talking about is likely making trade-offs somewhere. And unfortunately, I think this is nuance that gets lost in a lot of the conversations when people are comparing different privacy solutions. But there really is I don't think there's a single be all end all solution that has kind of solved everything. And maybe, we do have privacy protocols that have implemented really good privacy, but at the trade-off of something else. So that's kind of how I look at all of these things. If someone tells you that they've fixed everything, there's probably some fine print somewhere.
Yeah, and that's for anything in the world, pretty much. Um, and I think it's really cool because Bitcoin still is, the cryptocurrency that most people flock to, and so in making privacy improvements to it, I think is really awesome, and it's probably going to end up helping just a lot of people along the way and helping to guarantee
Well,
some of their
I think
rights.
that's also kind of an important point that, if we have work that we can do today that would make Bitcoin more private than it is today, then I think we should definitely do that, even if maybe some folks are kind of bearish on the perfect privacy goal. And the reason I say that is because Bitcoin is the most popular, the most well known, has the largest mind share, has the largest market share, so people are going to keep using it. And if there are obvious things we can fix now, then we should, because those new users coming in and using it might not care about privacy, might not know, and it just feels kind of irresponsible to me that, like, if we have these things that we can address now, even if they won't get us to the be all end all solution, we should just go ahead and fix those so that the new waves of people coming into Bitcoin in the next couple of years aren't being hit by something that could have been easily fixed.
Right. I have a couple more questions for you, and then I'll open it up for other people to ask. I already see one request here. Um, my second to last question is, you've talked a lot about educating users and kind of using design and improving technologies in a way where it makes privacy easier for them. On my end, I'm just a little bit confused by those two things, because a good example might be something like Telegram versus Signal, where a user has to be educated enough to turn on secret chats in Telegram versus just using Signal, where everything's end-to-end encrypted. So in my head, in other areas, these almost clash a little bit, but I think that I'm just not fully understanding what you mean by those two terms. So do you mind describing a little bit more what you mean by educating users, but you're also just making privacy a lot more frictionless for them, just so I can better understand what you mean?
Yeah, that's a great call out. So I think the first thing is, if it's not private by default, it won't get used, right? Because if we talk about, X percentage of the users of a system, some of them, a very small niche of them, are going to be power users, people who are comfortable changing defaults. Most people aren't. And I think the Telegram example is a great one, where people might have even known that they could turn on secret chats, but that extra friction of having to go into a menu and click a button just means that a majority of people aren't going to do it. And so, like in Bitcoin, this means if to use it more privately, you have to take extra steps. People are just not going to take those extra steps. And even worse, I think a lot of the other privacy solutions in Bitcoin that I've seen sometimes cost the user more in terms of on-chain fees. So even if they're willing to take the extra steps, eventually there's going to be an economic incentive for them to use the thing in the non-private way. So I think that's kind of the first and foremost. I think we're in complete agreement on that. When it comes to education, I think it's less about, like, hey, user, here are these settings that you need to go change, and more, one, explaining to the user why privacy is important. And I think that that's one where that's not Bitcoin specific. I think we just need to keep educating people. Privacy isn't for criminals. Privacy isn't for, bad people, despite what people may tell you. To me, it's a fundamental human right, and it's a safety thing. Like, we need to preserve people's privacy in a digital era, because information exists forever. And once it's out there, we can never claw it back. So I think kind of educating people as hey, this is why this is important. And then I think also educating people on trade-offs and why those trade-offs are being made. I think most people are willing to wait for something, or, we'll use the scanning as an example. I think if someone opens a Bitcoin wallet today and it doesn't immediately show their balance and, like, have this, like, snappy UX, and instead says something like scanning with, like, a timer, they might be like, oh, this sucks. And then they might switch to a wallet that is just giving them all this instant information despite them not running their own node. And I think we've missed an opportunity to educate the user there, where we're saying, like, hey, you might have noticed this wallet is behaving a little differently than other wallets. This is because this wallet is protecting your privacy. This wallet is not leaking any information to a third party. This wallet is probably going to, download more data than you're used to, and just kind of making the user aware of and explaining what benefits they're getting for maybe a different user experience is mostly what I'm talking about when it comes to education. And then I think also educating users just about the general options they have. So, like I mentioned earlier, users can always run their own nodes, and that's kind of the first and foremost like best way to use Bitcoin. So keeping that a part of the conversation of like, hey, we've built this wallet app, and here's kind of the spectrum of trade-offs that you can use, where you might outsource the scanning to someone else, or you might download a little bit more data to scan privately, or you might just run your own Bitcoin node, and then kind of explaining to people, what these trade-offs are and what they get at each step, um, is more, what I'm talking about, but never in the sense of like, hey, here's a wallet. In order to use this wallet privately, please go read our 10-page documentation on all the settings you need to change. Like that I think is where you've lost the battle. But instead, when a user downloads a wallet and their first experience with that wallet is the wallet informing them, hey, this wallet behaves certain ways by default because of these reasons. And this is the benefit to you, the user, as to why the wallet is behaving X way or Y way.
Really good way
That
of putting it. Um,
cool, because I
yeah,
felt
no,
like even as I was explaining it, I was like, I don't think I'm making sense here.
no, you are making sense. And I think I just know, I think I already kind of knew what you were trying to say. I just know that, um, someone's probably going to ask later. I'm kind of struggling to follow, and I think that really clears it up. And I don't know why, but the image that came to mind is, um, you could put a new BIP together that wallets can integrate, which pretty much has like a new version of the Microsoft Clippy with just
Yeah.
audio tidbits of your voice explaining why features are implemented a certain way as they click and tap around wallets.
Well, I'll give a shout out to my homies in the Bitcoin design community. They've been really great, um, in creating design guides and explainers for stuff like this, and great documentation. And there's been a few people working on design guides for silent payments in particular, and I mean really just knocking it out of the park, kind of explaining how silent payments work, why it's implemented in one way or another. And I think, organizations like the Bitcoin design community are creating some of that material that I hope to see, where if you don't care as a user, you just download an app, you start using it, it's got privacy by default, works great, clean designs, whatever. If you do care and you want to dig more in, or if you're a developer or a wallet team that kind of wants to learn more, then there's great resources over there, kind of explaining the theory behind a lot of this stuff.
Nice. And then my last question for you is, what are some other things you're working on? What's next for you, and what's kind of the future of privacy in Bitcoin, or are you going to migrate to other things?
Yeah, so I think the big one that I'm putting a lot of time into right now is the Bitcoin kernel project, which is more a taking the consensus code of Bitcoin and putting that into a library that, kind of encapsulates all of the consensus logic in a way that can be used by both external downstream projects from Bitcoin Core, and then also used by Bitcoin Core itself. That's the one I'm the most excited, and probably will be spending the majority of my time on going forward. And then the reason I think that one is important, it's not like there is no direct one-to-one, like, oh, this is a privacy improvement for Bitcoin, but I do see it as like a developer quality of life improvement for Bitcoin, where we can hopefully empower more builders in the ecosystem to build on Bitcoin, build Bitcoin applications with better tooling, and how this is relevant for silent payments. So one of the things that, like I mentioned earlier, thinking about how silent payments would integrate with existing wallet infrastructure. One of the things is like we need to build indexes for these light clients that want to download the tweet data. So one approach is, we put all those indexes in Bitcoin Core, and there is a PR that Shores has been working on to do that. But then that's kind of, you got to go through the Bitcoin Core review cycle. You got to go through the Bitcoin Core pace, and there's also, we don't. I personally don't want to see Bitcoin Core's code base continue to be the kitchen sink for all use cases, especially if those use cases, are only relevant to like a few users or a subset of users. So like in this example, adding a whole index just for silent payments when maybe only a percentage of Bitcoin users are going to use silent payments seems like a bad fit for putting it into Bitcoin Core. And so with the Bitcoin kernel, I've been experimenting with how we can build these indexes much quicker when we don't have to go through the Bitcoin RPC interface and we can more directly interact with block files. So that's an area where I see the Bitcoin kernel as just generally super important for the Bitcoin ecosystem, but also relevant for privacy projects like silent payments by just enabling developers to work with better tooling. Um, so that's kind of the main headspace. And then I'm also been spending a lot of time thinking about silent payments plus Lightning, like how to be thinking about how that would look in the future, how we can start testing and prototyping that. So there was like a Twitter thread a couple months ago about like silent payments plus swap and potentium addresses. And I just kind of like have been obsessed with that thought. So I've been writing up some drafts and ideas on that. I think the other future thing, still silent payments related, is there's still quite a bit of work when we think about how this integrates into just the full wallet ecosystem. So we have drafts for the PSBT spec. We've been talking about discrete log equivalency proofs for hardware signers, and actually Bitbox has kind of led the charge there and implemented sending to silent payment addresses, but with this really nice proof that the hardware wallet produced the address correctly. And this is one I'm really excited about because I think it solves another problem in Bitcoin of just more trustlessness between the signing device and the software app, and also just better defense against things like address poisoning and people tricking you into sending to a different address. So that's kind of some of the general areas that I've been thinking about. Maybe the last one is Music 2 and Frost, which are um, they're protocols for key aggregation in Bitcoin. Again, don't need a soft fork. They're kind of built off Taproot and Schnorr signatures. So anything I can do to kind of help get those down the line, because that would, one, improve things with silent payments, and I think also just bring a better level of usability, privacy for users who are using multi-sigs. So that's kind of the long list of things that I'm hoping to work on in the future.
Wow, yeah, definitely keeping busy. And where can people kind of keep up with all that you're working on?
Twitter, I post less frequently these days, but we'll post updates about things I'm working on there. But really GitHub too. I mean, GitHub is my social media. I go there and see what all my friends are working on, and then you can see updates of the repos that I'm doing there. I'd say those are probably the two best places.
Nice. All right. Well, I'll make sure to leave links to that on my end. Um, and I'll kind of leave it in your court, Josie, to finish anything out that you want to tell everyone listening. And then I'm going to ask everybody listening if you want to request to speak and maybe ask Josie a question, go ahead and start leaving your requests because my Twitter client, for whatever reason, takes like a whole minute to update to let me know what's going on with everyone else. So, um, yeah, we
Yeah, I would say in closing thoughts, just again, thanks for having me. I would also say shout out to Cake Wallet because in designing a protocol and working on your own implementations, really the best feedback you get is someone who didn't write the spec coming up and trying to implement it. So it was really great to work with Raphael on that in the early days and kind of work through some of the rough edges. And it was cool to see it, silent payments come alive in a wallet. I think, in terms of closing thoughts, maybe relevant to the audience, if any of this sounds cool to you and you're excited about silent payments and you're a developer or interested in getting involved in a developer capacity, definitely reach out to me. There's tons of stuff to work on in just, many hands get the jobs done. So I'm always happy to try to help onboard people and kind of point them at projects that need help or review. So that's my shameless, like, please help if this is something you're excited about. And to put that's both the fun thing about something like this and also maybe the frustrating thing is it's open source. So, it takes a community of people working on it and reviewing it to get it over the finish line, which is a part that I particularly enjoy, but can also be slow and daunting at times. Um, but yeah, that's pretty much all I had. So if you want to open it up for questions.
Yeah, no, thank you for your time too, Josie. And I'm glad that, thank you for the shout out. I know it's, Raphael especially put a ton of work into it.
Yeah, shout out to Raphael. Raphael's awesome.